welcome to Arcadeology, a podcast about video game history and design. I'm Kevin, and today we are speaking with industry veteran David Fox about his time at LucasFilm Games, his exploration of immersive entertainment, and his reunion working with his old LucasArts crew on Thimbleweed Park. This will be a two-part episode, with the first part focusing on the early days of the point-and-click adventure game genre. The games he worked on at Lucasfilm include Rescue on Fractalus, Labyrinth, Maniac Mansion, Zack McCracken and the Alien Mindbenders, and Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. And while he was the director of operations, the studio produced Monkey Island, Loom, and Secret Weapons of the Luftwaffe. Without any further ado, let's get on with the interview. David, thanks for coming on the show.
I'm happy to be here.
So, prior to joining Lucasfilm Games, what were you working on?
Well, before Lucasfilm, I was doing a nonprofit microcomputer center with my wife. And we started the Marine Computer Center in 1977, and we ran it for about 5 years. And after that, we ended up turning it over to the students, the kids who were running it with us, who were volunteering. And we ended up with, I think by then, maybe 40 or so microcomputers, lots of Atari 800s and 400s and Apple IIs, and our first one was a processor technology Solve 20. Looked very cool, but it didn't last past a few years. And during that time, I would get programs from other people, from other companies like Adventure International, and we ended up doing conversions for them, converting the games to other computers. So like we got the Radio Shack version, the TRS-80 version, and we converted it to like an Apple II. And by being in the code and, seeing how they did coding and games, that was kind of my education on game design or game programming.
So you're basically creating ports.
Yeah, we were porting mostly from Radio Shack to Apple II and to CPM. We did a couple of books while I was there, and one of them was, the last one I did was on computer animation, called Computer Animation Primer. And the entire text of the book is online, so people can still look at it. But the first half was kind of on overall animation, state of the art at the time, in 1980, early 80s, 81. And the second half was how to do animation on your Atari 800. And, lots of programs and combination of mostly using BASIC, but with some assembly language routines. And during the research part, I contacted Lucasfilm, which was in my neighborhood, coincidentally.
Right down the street.
Not quite that close, but it was in the same county. And they had just started up this new computer division a couple years earlier. So I hung out with them and got to interview them and talk about where computers are, animation is then and where it was going. And got some sample clips that I could put in the book. We had a flip book thing where you could flip through the book and see in the corners, see animated little videos. That was just a nice connection. And then about a year later, after I finished the book, I heard from one of our computer center members who actually worked at Industrial Light and Magic that Lucasfilm was starting up this new games group. And I immediately contacted Ed Catmull, who was the head of the computer division. He said, we just hired the new manager for the group. He'll be starting in a few weeks, and I'll make sure he contacts you for an interview. And that's pretty much what happened. I ended up becoming the third person hired for Lucasfilm Games. And after Peter Langston, who was the manager, and Rob Poor, who was already in the computer division but transferred over to the games group. And that's how it happened. And the book that I had, my Computer Animation Primer, I think, was one of the things that sold it, because it showed that I knew a little bit about animation, but also knew about the Atari 800, which, again, coincidentally, was going to be the first system we were going to do games on, because Atari had given Lucasfilm $1 million to help start the games group. It's kind of like if I had thought backwards and planned this all out, I couldn't have done a better job of doing all the different steps and just being in the right place and having the book, having a computer center where people from Industrial Light and Magic could be members, and that whole part, everything. So it was
just
cool.
a beautiful confluence of events.
Yeah, it was all planned, I'm sure.
That's awesome. The first game you did was Rescue on Fractalus, correct?
Right.
And then after that, one of your earliest credits is a video game adaptation of the movie Labyrinth. How did that project come to you?
When we first started, when I was working on the first game, Rescue on Fractalus, I had intended it to be a Star Wars game. That was my, this is my chance to actually be inside of a Star Wars movie by doing a game in the Star Wars universe. And found out, like, within the first couple of days I got there, that we weren't allowed to do Star Wars games because the rights to Star Wars had already been sold to other companies for, big bucks. And, like Atari for the arcades, and I think Parker Brothers for the home computers or home video game system. And so we didn't have the license. It wasn't available. They kind of said, okay, well, I guess we can't do games based on Star Wars. And, a couple of years later, Lucasfilm was producing Labyrinth. It wasn't the family jewels. It wasn't their own. And I guess they felt safe in letting us experiment with trying to turn it into a game. So they basically said, hey, would you like to do this? Steve Arnold, who is now our general manager, asked some of us if we were interested. And I said, sure, it sounds cool. We had the script. We had some test video footage on a videotape, and kind of got the idea of what the movie was about, and went from there.
Oh, that's neat, because how that kind of turned around on itself, and that since Star Wars was untouchable, it was like, oh well, you just play with this. Here you go, here you guys go, try this.
Right. And then we got to a brainstorming session in England. A group of us flew out there for a week and met with Douglas Adams of Hitchhiker's Guide fame. And he was a friend of Jim Henson's, who is the director of the film. It was Douglas and Christopher Cerf, who was a longtime friend of Jim Henson's, who was a songwriter and writer for Children's Television Workshop. And then on our end, it was myself and Steve Arnold and Charlie Kellner, who is the technical lead on the game, and Brenda, who is from Activision, who's our publisher for this.
Very cool. So Douglas Adams, he had some input early on in the game's development, from what I've read. And what presence, if any, does he have in the final product of the game?
I think he had a couple of ideas that definitely made it through. It was his idea to start off as a text adventure and then open it up into a graphics adventure partway in. And I think the analogy was kind of like the Wizard of Oz movie, where it starts out in black and white, and then when they make it to Oz, everything's in color. So here we start off in old school text adventure style, which is pretty much most of what adventures were at that time.
Right.
I think still
the Colossal Cave Adventure type style.
Or even the Infocom adventures were still really popular. And Sierra was also doing graphic adventures, but they were, I think at that point, they weren't that sophisticated. And maybe they'd gotten into animation. I mean, the first ones they did were basically screenshots with text, with a text adventure interface. So that's what we did. It's a really short text adventure. I was a little worried that people would start this and think that we had lied, about what kind of games we were going to be doing. We had all these pictures of graphic adventures and really realized it was really a text adventure. But it was try to keep it as short as possible. And then when you get to this movie theater and movie theater happened to be playing Labyrinth, and you end up being sucked into the movie. And from that point on, you're in the graphic adventure. Another one of his ideas had to do with Adumbrate. And this is a spoiler. I won't even say what it is. There's the word Adumbrate, and it was use it on a specific character in the game. And I had no idea what the word meant. And it kind of means foreshadow. And it's kind of esoteric. And it was like, it's probably our first what the fuck type of types of things in this game where people have to do trial and error across everything in order to find it, which is probably not the best way to do that.
Yeah, my friend Phil, the Conquistador, he refers to that as moon logic.
Yep. I think we call it graphic adventure game logic also. Yeah. Like, and later in doing games, when I play games from other companies, and when we do our own. I always really hated it when there was a puzzle where I'd be hitting my head against the computer screen for an hour or two, and then finally give up and try to find what the answer was, and thinking there's no way I ever would have thought of that. And to me, that's an indication of a not a great graphic adventure design puzzle. If you say, "Oh, I should have thought of that," of course, that makes total sense. Then it's on the player, and if it's like I never thought of it, it's on the designer.
One of the things about Labyrinth was that it didn't have the straight up parser interface that Sierra was doing. What inspired you to move away from that?
We actually were planning to do a parser originally, and we realized, first of all, we were on a really tight schedule because we had to try to hit the game completion point at the same time the film was coming out. I think we had 6 to 8 months. We ended up realizing that there's no way we could end up doing a rich enough text parser to compete with, say, Sierra's text parsers or Infocoms. And some people would immediately think that ours is really stupid and really bad. And so we said, okay, what if we could come up with an alternate interface where we give you the options and you have to choose from a certain set of options. They're all right there. I think it was my idea to come up with I call it a slot machine interface, because you kind of have two wheels of scrolling words for verbs and for objects. You just basically scroll them and choose the one you want. That way, all the options were right there, and you didn't have to wonder what you could actually do. So, we all hated the guess the parser style of interface, where you were actually typing in bush or something, and it was supposed to be shrub, or vice versa, and the programmer had missed a synonym for the word you were using. This totally avoided that because you knew what the options were.
Pretty interesting. I remember actually Ron Gilbert mentioning that in a postmortem for Maniac Mansion, the exact phrase, guess the parser.
Right. I think that was probably his phrase. And the Maniac Mansion came after Labyrinth. And I don't know to what degree Ron was influenced by our UI. I mean, he came up with I think a much simpler way to do it and more intuitive, because all the words were not only right there, but you could see them all rather than having to scroll through them, as was the inventory. We did have to scroll through inventory once you had a bunch of them, but it was an easier way to do it. And it just much more refined. And that's, of course, what we ended up keeping for the next multiple adventure games.
Yeah. I mean, that's that UI or some version of it is, I believe, until, I guess, I want to say Full Throttle or Sam and Max, like that's when it really starts kind of fading out the word based UI,
Right.
if I recall correctly. But that seems like I think it was around Tim Schafer's era. But speaking of Maniac Mansion, when did you get involved in Maniac Mansion?
Well, Ron and Gary had already worked out the design, and then Ron spent close to a year working on Scum, on the script creation utility for Maniac Mansion, which was the programming language and the whole system behind it. And I think he first attempted to code the game directly in 6502 assembly, and that would take forever. And then Chip Morningstar, who's also one of our people in the games group who did the Habitat game, suggested doing, basically creating an interpreter. So we could write the code in English, and it would, compress it into P code, and then it would be much easier to convert that to other platforms too. And that's what he ended up doing, but it took him close to a year to write that. So when he said, I think I had come off a Labyrinth recently, and he said, hey, would you be interested in helping me for a month or two on this game? It shouldn't take much longer than that to code it.
Famous last words.
Yeah, I know. And I said, yeah, it sounds great. So I came on, nothing had been coded yet. He might have had one room up as a test room. So I was basically coding while he was finishing up the system and, creating tools as I was doing. And so I had a lot of impact on saying, hey, I really want something to make this easier. Can we have a shortcut for this? Or, spent 2 hours trying to fix get something to work and realizing it wasn't my bug. It was, in the system. And so it was kind of, that made it take a lot longer because I'm basically coding on a moving target, or, something that was maybe pre-beta in terms of being ready. But I ended up being on it for maybe 6 months and got most of the game done, and then had to go on to my next project. But Ron was left with cleaning up some of the bugs. I don't know how much longer, maybe another month or two. One of the choices that he and Gary made early on was to have multiple kids you could select, and you had to have testing across all the various combinations, which was enormously complex, way more than just if you had a set number of kids. And you had to have to make sure that you could win with any combination you chose. So I probably did 70 or 80% of the scripting. I did most of the wiring of the rooms and a lot of the cutscenes, and Ron did a bunch of them too. There's some of the writing, some of the more complex ones or whatever. He might have taken those and done those. It's hard to remember who did what. I remember spending time working on code that would get one of the characters from their room, like Weird Ed, from his bedroom all the way down to the front door to answer the front door, and trying to do it realistic enough so that if you happen to be wandering around the house and he was on his way down, you'd see him come through the room. So it really felt like there was a space, and they really were moving through that space, rather than just popping him to the target room.
As a kid, I think I assumed like, oh, that makes sense. He would walk through all the rooms. But later, as an adult, I'm like, well, I think a lot of people, a lot of game designers would just kind of take that shortcut where, like, take it, move them from here to here, just teleport. But to me, it makes sense that, I had Bernard out in the hallway and Ed actually caught him on his way down to the door.
Right. And we had to do the same thing with Edna, and I think there was the two characters that would wander. I guess with the tentacles too. So it was hard because those are possibility of getting really buggy. I think there are a lot of issues with those. I know with Thimbleweed Park, which I'm skipping ahead, I have a routine that did that also. And that was the source of a whole bunch of issues during testing. Would it remember what was happening when you saved the game? If we restored it, where would the person be? And it was more complex. So it was cool to do it, but sure was a headache.
Right. A little overambitious.
Yeah. And I think this was the game where, Ron kind of invented the word cutscene.
Yes.
And
yeah.
I don't know if there were cutscenes before. If they were, they weren't called that.
Yeah. And what's funny is I've actually spent a little bit of time. I was gonna do a video on the origin of the cutscene. I've spent some time looking into it, and from every source I see, the first time the phrase cutscene exists is Maniac Mansion, because it was in I guess it was in the code. It cut scene. I think some earlier examples people consider, like, those little interstitial animations that would play during, I guess, Miss Pac-Man are considered cutscenes as well, just not as complex. But yeah, it is an interesting topic, like something that is so ubiquitous now in games is originating from Maniac Mansion. I find that really cool.
The fact that we were in a film company probably had something to do with that, because we really, a bunch of us were really interested in story type games. Other than Rescue and Fractalist, that was the only game I did that had any kind of action. All the rest were graphic adventures. So that felt like my style. That was something I was actually interested. If you remember, I was doing those conversions of text adventures back at the American Computer Center, so it was kind of a good fit for me.
So, correct me if I'm wrong. I've read that you wrote most of the dialogue in Maniac Mansion.
Yeah, I can't remember. I would say in terms of dialogue that happens when you're interacting with objects, so it's less interacting with other people. I probably wrote almost like 95% of that. If it's dialogue in a cutscene, then I don't know, maybe 50, 70%, somewhere in that range, with Ron doing the rest. I mean, there was also, I didn't know what tone he was looking for. So he had to do a lot of the dialogue in order to establish the voice of the various characters. So it would be what he wanted. And I had to kind of match what he wanted. So that was kind of the way we did it. Because I was coming into something which came out of Gary and Ron's heads, and I wanted to match what they were looking to do rather than trying to take it off in my direction.
I remember hearing somewhere as a kid or a teenager that originally when Bernard was referred to as a tuna head, it was originally supposed to be shithead. Is there any truth to that?
That's probably true. And tuna head was definitely Ron's. I didn't come up with that phrase. It's probably likely that he wrote the opening cutscene in the very beginning of the game, and that's where I think that came in, right in the very beginning. There's no way we knew.
No way you could get away with that either,
right.
Except sneaking in the microwavable hamster. Who was responsible for that, by the way?
Oh, that was me.
That was you.
Yeah.
What?
There was a hamster. There was a microwave, and I just had this. And I was probably wiring up the microwave in the kitchen, and I said, "Oh, what if?" And I went to Gary without telling Ron, and I said, "Could you please give me a blood animation for the front of the microwave?" I don't know if I told him what it was for. I might have. And then I coded it up, and I brought Ron in there and said, "Okay, try this." And he did it. And, he, laughed a lot. So I wasn't sure if he was into it. So it was kind of more for him.
Right.
I did it as a joke, and it stayed in the game.
Yeah. Famously, it stayed in the initial batch of the Nintendo version of the game.
Yep.
And that was a whole thing.
Well, they didn't. Well, because it's not game related. It was like an Easter egg. So they caught the stuff that was in line of the game, and they did a lot of. There's a whole great article that Doug Crockford, who was in charge of the conversion, did. Describing all the things they had to change in order to meet their standards. I mean, even I think there was a pinup calendar.
Yes.
Of a mummy.
Yes.
So she's fully clothed in bandages.
Right.
But she looked like she might be naked, so
yeah,
they had to go.
There was a statue in the hallway, if I recall, as well. Yeah.
Yeah.
Nintendo was extremely strict back in those days.
Yeah. They didn't mind as much with the violence stuff. So I'm not sure if I don't know if they would have minded with the hamster. They probably, I don't know, maybe they would have if they had seen it. But for anything that had a sexual connotation, that's where they were killing us on.
Zach McCracken, quite possibly my favorite game as a kid, even though I'm not sure I ever beat it until I was older. Where did the ideas for Zach McCracken come from? Because Maniac Mansion, Ron had, it seems like it was a pretty straightforward, it's a send up of like 1950s horror films. Zach McCracken it's so wacky. And I mean that in the best possible way. So what influenced you to design that?
Well, I was, I think a couple of things. When I was really tired of being locked in a mansion, and I wanted to expand out and have something that felt like it covered a much greater territory. So why not the entire planet and Mars? And so that was kind of the push. But it was also, I was, back into this from the 70s, and I was very interested in new agey kinds of stuff. I believe in a lot of that stuff, or I probably still do. I definitely did back then, although it wasn't, something I thought about a whole lot. But the idea of doing a game where I could introduce a bunch of these new agey concepts in a game without them being like heavy and like trying to beat someone over the head about them was kind of the push. Steve Arnold, our manager, was also supportive of that whole theme, and he had a friend up in the Seattle area named David Spangler, who was a spiritualist and wrote a bunch of books and was very well known, and he thought that it would be a great idea if I went up there and brainstorm with David on different ways to kind of bring in a whole bunch of these ideas into the game. So that's what I did for like a couple of days. I flew up there. That's probably where Mount Rainier comes into the game, because it was in David's backyard essentially, and we just wrote down all the different places of power, or where anything mystical is supposedly happened on Earth, and came up with different ways we could squeeze those in. David was the one who told me about the first UFO sighting around Mount Rainier in 1947, I think it was. That kind of became the impetus for Zach going out to that area. Was a combination of a story on the 50-year anniversary of that, because we put the game into the future, even though we created the game in 1987, 88. It took place like 9 years later. So I had this, very much like with Labyrinth, I had this list of great ideas, and I had to go back home and figure out how to take all these ideas and put them into a cohesive game. And so I spent the next 2 or 3 months like working that out and coming up with the story. And I had a design doc that I passed around, as was the custom of what we did at Lucas. We'd usually share our work with other designers and get feedback. And Ron felt that even though it was intended as a comedy, that it wasn't funny enough. It wasn't out there enough. So we had a brainstorming meeting in our division, in our group, with a bunch of the designers, and to see if we could ratchet it up a notch. And that's where Zach's name came. We actually used a phone book, Marin phone book, and first his name was going to be Jason, and Zach and McCracken came out of 2 separate names in the phone book. That's where we came up with the title of the game. I knew there were aliens and they were trying to brainwash you. We came up with alien mind benders, I think, by going just on a whiteboard and just coming up with all these things, and just kind of pushed it. And the idea that Zach originally was going to be a mainstream media reporter, and instead put him into a tabloid newspaper where it was all schlock and fake stuff,
right?
Fake news.
Yeah,
fake news. And that just pushed it enough into that other direction. I mean, when I went back like a year later and looked at the original design doc, everything was there. So nothing really changed in the design. It was just kind of twisting it a bit more to make it put it into wacky land. And I started working on it and realized this is going to take a long time. I knew how long it takes to code one of these games, so we invited Matthew Kane, who was already there working on project in the education group, if you'd like to come in and become a co-designer and scripter with me to help me code the game up. So he came on pretty early, and after the design was done, but before I actually started coding. So very much like my role with Maniac Mansion, he was came in at that stage in Zach. And of course, when you have, even though the game was designed, as with Maniac Mansion, it was designed fairly loosely. Like I knew what the rooms were or the locations, I knew what the objects were, I knew what the puzzles were, but not any of the dialogue or the interactions or, a lot of things that come when you actually see the art and actually start putting it together. It's a long answer to a short question.
It's very fascinating. I mean, I always love the game, and I know it has, of all the original Lucasfilm Games graphic adventures, I feel like Zach has always had this cult fascination. But what's it like to have that cult following, more so than other Lucas games? Because over the years, I've kept tabs. There's always been fan sequels and fan remakes, and just people out there wanting more of that specific weird little universe.
Well, what's weird about this is that, first of all, this, of all the games I've done, I'd say this is probably the closest to my personality, my heart, my area of interests, areas of interest. And So it's probably my favorite game of the ones I've done, because if you think about it, Rescue and Fractalus, yeah, but that was, that was my wanting to be in a Star Wars movie. So that was why I did that. Labyrinth, it was already, the story was established. Maniac Mansion was established. Then it did Indiana Jones, The Last Crusade. The story was established. So I was basically in those three games, I'm using other people's characters and story to come, to help create a game. Where Zach was, of those games I did there, was really the only one where it was completely from my imagination. Yeah. And, I've said this before. I think all of us assumed that these games would have a lifespan of maybe 1 or 2 or 3 years. And basically they'd die when the computers we designed them for became obsolete. And so I kind of let go of it. I basically left Lucasfilm after 1992 and did another couple of years in gaming, and then kind of went off into other directions for quite a while. And it wasn't until, I say, 2004 when I was invited to speak at a couple of conferences in Norway and in Finland, that I found out that people still not only knew the games, but someone showed me Zach running on his Nokia handheld phone, his mobile phone, in a Commodore 64 emulator on the phone. And I said, and this was, before smartphones. This is like, again, 2004. And this is just, a phone with a color screen, and it had a low joystick, and you could actually play the game. And so the idea that I totally missed was that as computers and phones and everything else became more powerful, you could do emulators and have things run even faster than they did on the original platform because of how fast the speeds of the CPUs were going. So when I gave the talks there, I was blown away that everyone knew those games, that they not only knew them, but people came up and asked me to sign their boxes of them. And I think eBay was around then. People were buying these games in pristine condition for hundreds of dollars or thousands sometimes. And I just I hitting my hand to the head. It's like, why didn't I buy a box of these games back when I could have? Had no idea they'd be collector's items, right, or that any of the shirts would have been collector's items. Right. Just none of that even occurred to me that would happen. And we thought we were doing the equivalent of a black and white silent film,
right?
That where the projectors would go away and you wouldn't have any way to play them. So
right, that
was amazing. And then I heard that people, especially in Germany, where most of the fan base, I think, is, that there were multiple fan base sequels that were created on the game, based on the game. Whenever I heard about them, I would, be honored, give them my blessing. I didn't want to participate too much because I felt like that would be going a little too far. I mean, this is the 30th anniversary year for Zach. So there's this guy in Italy named Daniel Spadani, I might be mispronouncing it, who's been doing kind of these fan short videos of various video games. Mm-hmm. And a lot of them are, the Lucas Adventures. He did one on Zach a while back. Then I guess he's been getting better and better on them, and he decided to revisit Zach and do a new one. I guess there's a small Italian film festival that heard about that and invited him to screen this video, the premiere at the film festival. Then they decided to reach out to me and ask me to come out and speak on this, afterwards. So now I'm going to Italy.
That's so cool.
to give a talk about Zach after we see this, video that Daniel is creating. It's really, it's really exciting to do that and to know that people actually, there actually know about the game. So right. Italy too. So for some reason, I don't know, our games in the United States, Sierra had been doing adventure games for many years before we started. Right. And they had this huge installed base. In Europe, I don't think they ever bothered to either do distribution or to do translations. And so when we started distributing our graphic adventures in Europe, they kind of filled this gap that where there was a hole
that Sierra had left.
Sierra hadn't done yet.
Yeah.
So that's, even now, say with Thimbleweed Park, a huge proportion of the people, the backers, were from Europe.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, and I know with Zach, the biggest fan base is in Germany.
Yeah.
And I'm not exactly sure why, if there's a match with my sense of humor and theirs, or Boris, who did the translation, did a really, really good job. And that helped. A combination of those things. I don't know, but I'll take it. And it's really fun.
Most gamers I talk to who kind of look back in that era, most of their connection tends to be initially to the Sierra games. And I'm strangely the opposite. I never played a single Sierra game in that time period. It was all LucasFilm Games and eventually LucasArts. So I have this weird perspective that is very skewed towards the Lucas games. So it's fascinating to hear. That's kind of how Zach spread far and wide is because Sierra never really spent much time on their localization elsewhere.
I think we also had this. We set up a kind of a competition with Sierra in our minds. I don't think they really noticed us that much. And there was this frustration that we'd do this new game and it would sell okay,
right?
And they'd do one, and we thought their game was not as good as ours, and it'd sell like 10 times as many copies in the United States. And this frustration: why aren't people recognizing our games here? We ended up doing a softball game with them. We had two, the LucasFilm Games team and the Sierra team. And at the Skywalker Ranch, there's a softball field. So we did it there, and they totally creamed us, which made it even worse. We invited Ken and Roberta to a screening of Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. That's one thing that they couldn't do.
Right.
So in my mind, we're thinking, okay, try to top this.
Right.
We have a big movie that our company is doing. And we were showing, at the same time showing the game at the screening. So we had, in a separate area. But we'd see stuff that they were doing and realize, oh shit, we now have to up our animation levels.
Right.
I remember working on Indie, and we saw one of their new games and had way more animation, full screen animation that they were doing, and we hadn't done that yet. So we had to go back and create an animation system where you could do much more complete animations. I think in Zack and Maniac, there really weren't any special case animations. It was really walking and turning, and even with Zack falling down, I just rotated him.
Right.
Had him face, front, left, back, right, and over again to, kind of fake animation. And a lot of it was in your imagination. Right. Now we had to do Indy whipping the plug from in the catacombs, I guess it was. Yeah. And, where you actually see a whole payoff. We were kind of trying to compete with them and make sure we were not being left behind. And I'm guessing they never paid any attention to us. It's kind of like, the flea biting the elephant kind of
right thing. They had their own things to worry about. Thanks for listening. Part 2 will come out in 2 weeks from today, and in that we will be discussing the second phase of David's career. If you'd like to find me on the internet, you can check out my YouTube channel at youtube.com/arcadeology, or follow me on Twitter at thearcadeologist. Take care, everyone.